Usually a car manufacturer starts its racing line, but here a racing company started its manufacturing company. The company was founded by the youngest Grand Prix winner at his time, the company whose first production car was a three-seater, and weirdly enough had gold in its engine bay. Whatever magic they had, that quarter-decade-old car is still the fastest naturally aspirated production car ever. Whether all of this had you dazed or amazed, this is the story of McLaren. The story of McLaren begins with its founder, Bruce McLaren. Bruce Leslie McLaren was born in Auckland, New Zealand on the 30th of August 1937 to parents Les and Ruth. His parents ran a service station and workshop in the city of Remuera, Auckland. Racing was in Bruce's blood. His father Les was a motorcycle racing enthusiast who had to drop it after sustaining several injuries. But his racing endeavors continued as he switched to racing cars at club level. Bruce spent a lot of time around his father and his service station. At just 15 years old, Bruce retrofitted a 1929 Austin Ulster car along with his father. In a project that lasted 2 years, McLaren was able to turn it into a racing machine. At this time, he learned everything about cars and developed a deep passion, a passion that left its mark on the history of automobiles. The Ulster was much more than just a restoration project. He drove the Ulster in a local hill climb event in 1953, which he ended up winning. A few years later, in 1958, Bruce left his hometown and moved to the UK. At the time, there was a Driver to Europe scheme which was created to encourage anti-podium drivers to compete with the best of the world's drivers. It was during this time that he met his mentor, Jack Brabham. Jack Brabham introduced Bruce to Cooper Cars, which was a London-based race team. In 1959, Bruce joined the F1 team of Cooper Cars, a relationship that lasted a long and successful 7 years. Bruce was quick to make his presence known. At just 22 years and 80 days old, Bruce won the 1959 U.S. Grand Prix, becoming the youngest Grand Prix winner. This record lasted 4 decades until Fernando Alonso broke the record in the 2003 Hungarian Grand Prix. Bruce continued to rack up victories, which included even 3 more Grand Prix wins. Later, Bruce went on to drive for Jaguar, Aston Martin, and Ford. It was during his stint with Ford that he won the Le Mans 24 Hours race in 1966. In 1963, Bruce founded Bruce McLaren Motor Racing Limited. That company still exists to date and remains to the Formula One Championship as McLaren. McLaren continued racing and won in Coopers. The next year, Bruce and his team built the first McLaren sports car, which was called the M1A, which was a menace in the car racing scene. A while later, they produced the M1B, which was even faster and was the key to the doors of the Can-Am Championship. If you're wondering how fast the car was, the M1B was faster than the F1 cars at that time. In 1967, Bruce and Denny Hulme's Can-Am cars won 5 of the 6 races. The following 5 seasons were known as the Bruce and Denny Show. They absolutely dominated their competition. At the same time, the McLaren Racing Company was doing great in the Formula One division. Bruce had another dream. He wanted to create a car for the streets. Unfortunately, he could not live to see his dream come true. While he was testing a prototype race car at Goodwood in 1970, he died in a car accident. A tragic end to Bruce, who was just 32 years old at the time. One could only console myself by saying that he died doing what he loved the most. If one believed that his dreams died along with him, they were wrong. His dreams lingered around waiting for someone to fulfill, and it did, but after a long wait. After Bruce died, Teddy Mayer took over, and the McLaren team went on to win the first F1 Constructors title in 1974, as the Brazilian Emerson Fittipaldi took the crown in his McLaren M23. The racing legend James Hunt also won the 1976 Drivers' Championship, defeating Ferrari in the same vehicle. And now for the lingering dream. Ron Dennis took over the racing company and merged it with the project that he was already running, called the Project 4 Racing Team in 1980. And almost a decade later, a delayed flight was to create history. Well, not exactly. Ron Dennis, Gordon Murray, the technical director, and shareholder Mansour Ojei were waiting for a flight, and their conversation sparked the idea for building a McLaren road car. Bruce's dream was brought back to life. They wanted to build the world's fastest production car, the McLaren F1. For this, the McLaren had to be low weight and high power. To do this, they used carbon fiber, which was relatively new at the time and was also very expensive. Their engine was actually outsourced to the Germans at BMW, where they created a powerful V12 engine. But to harness all this power, they needed an engine bay that could withstand the heat. You guys can take a guess with what material they went with. It was gold. Yes, actual gold. They were definitely single-minded on creating the finest piece of machinery. What comes next could be even more astonishing. The F1 had its driver's seat in the middle. No, it was not so that you could drive the same car in the UK and the US. It was because that's how race cars were designed. The McLaren even had 2 seats in the rear. The McLaren was sold at a price over $1 million. This beast of a car remains the fastest naturally aspirated production car the world has ever seen. Bruce's dream has finally come true, and it couldn't have been any better than this. The F1 entered competition with a few modifications and was named the F1 GTR. The F1 GTR, being merely a modified street car, went on to win the 24-hour Le Mans in 1995. If that doesn't tell you how powerful the F1 was, I don't know what else will. After the huge success of M1, McLaren collaborated with Mercedes. This collaboration led to the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren, which was released in 2003. It was a Grand Tourer model and had a top speed of 207 miles per hour, but the project was mostly Mercedes than McLaren. The McLaren company was silent for some time. In 2010, a spin-off company called McLaren Automotive was created. This stirred up a lot of heads. In 2011, the McLaren MP412C was released, and this became the first ever production car that in its entirety was designed and built by McLaren. The 12C was a huge success and a comeback for McLaren. Their very next car was a hybrid called the P1, a hybrid that could produce power over 900. The car was way ahead of its time. The McLaren went on to release several other vehicles which were a part of 6 different series, including the P1 during 2013 and 2016. The other series were the McLaren 650S, the McLaren 570S, the McLaren 625C, the McLaren 675LT, and the McLaren 540C. McLaren Automotive was a huge commercial success. The success was not only commercial, but it was also highly acclaimed by critics and consumers alike. All of their cars were built for perfection. At the end of Q1 2016, they released a roadmap showing the release of 15 more cars in the upcoming 6-year cycle. And to surprise everyone, they even outdid that number, producing 22 vehicles across 9 series. One among these cars was the McLaren Senna, which was unveiled in 2017. The name Senna would not be unfamiliar to those interested in the racing world. It was named after Ayrton Senna, who was an integral part of McLaren's Formula One team. His victories included 3 Formula One Drivers' Championships and 35 Formula One Grand Prix races. McLaren did their best to honor their decorated driver. McLaren says that the Senna is, quote, the most track-focused road car we have ever built, and it will set the fastest lap times of any McLaren to date. The Senna produces 789 horsepower and has a top speed of 208 miles per hour. With a 0 to 60 in just 2.7 seconds, the Senna is priced at just over $1 million. In the same year, Ron Dennis, who took over McLaren and brought it to heights it had never seen before, decided that it was the end of his involvement with McLaren, which lasted 37 years. He sold all his shares and stepped down from the chairman position. Ron Dennis made sure that the legacy of McLaren continued to live. McLaren continues to design the most sophisticated and powerful cars to ever enter the streets. The future of McLaren seems to be as bright as it ever was. McLaren continues to represent the dreams and values of its founder, Bruce McLaren. Who would have thought that a 15-year-old and an old Ulster would change the history of the automobile industry? Be sure to like and subscribe for more interesting stories.